Islam will continue to be triumphant until there have been 12 Khulafa, all of them from Al-Quraysh.
The God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever.
This is my brother, my executor, and my successor among you, so listen to him and obey.
My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting.
Whoso obeys me obeys God. Whoever disobeys me disobeys God. Whoever disobeys my commander disobeys me.
The Lord said to me, You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession.
Two systems of government, two visions for life on earth. Whichever is true changes everything. This is Christ and Khulafa.
Cool. So what's our background on this? What's the summary of why people are rioting and protesting all over France right now?
Depends on your sources. No. Well, just like the wrongful use of power from the police. Just like they just didn't do their right. Well, okay. The murder of Nahel started the protests that have long history in France over police brutality in France towards its citizens and just people living in France.
Right.
And so the basic backdrop of this one seems to be that a couple of years ago, the French police were authorized to use lethal force at traffic stops if people show any kind of threatening behavior. And basically, Nahel was stopped at a traffic stop, and something caused him to just drive the car forward, and the French police shot him in response to that. Initially, they said that they thought he was driving to try and run someone over, but later video show that there's no one directly in the path of the car. So the combination of what initially happened and the video that came out later seems that the French police killed someone without really having due cause to do so, and then lied about exactly how it happened to try and cover it up.
And basically they've come to the point where the prosecution version is like, he is saying that Nahel, I don't know if I'm saying that right, Nahel, accelerated the car, that he accelerated the car after being stopped. The police version, that was a lie, because of the video, everyone knows, he wasn't trying to drive over anyone, he wasn't trying to hurt anybody. That was just a lie. So the police version is debunked. And then basically the third version is from a passenger, I guess. And they're saying that he didn't accelerate, that he basically put his foot off of the brake because of the physical interaction through the window between the cop and Nahel. And so it made him release the brake, which is different to I'm gonna accelerate and drive off, because when I saw the video, I felt if I was trying to drive off, I would have accelerated way faster. It kind of did look like a slow, weird, he seemed to, anyway, but that's not pertinent necessarily.
Well, it's part of the story.
Just a point of view,
Yeah.
Maybe someone in that lane would have not driven that fast, but I think if you're trying to evade the police, I would have accelerated much, very fast. Right. But this seems very so I could see if it could have been the brake that he just left off the brake. So regardless, right?
Sure.
And so I guess, any more recap, or do we want to?
Yeah, so I think that's about it. And then there's been riots, a lot of some peaceful protests, and then rioting and looting, business being burned down and looted, and lots of damage all across the country.
Right, lots of damage, lots of police presence, lots of arrests, lots of counter, activity, riot, let's call it disorderly conduct, in response to the police presence.
And then, okay. Good with recap?
Yep.
Okay, let's jump into the comparison to the U.S. riots in 2020.
Guess what, everyone? You got problems too. Everyone looked at America and was like, oh, America's awful, America's awful.
Right.
I think it just proves that this is bubbling under the surface everywhere.
Everywhere.
Right. It's bubbling under the surface everywhere.
Because of human nature.
Right.
Whether you're a cop or whether you're a citizen.
Right.
So we actually had a French girl from Marseille stay with us as an exchange student a few months back, and Marseille has seen some of the worst rioting
in France.
In France, and I just
Totally.
checked in with her, said, "Hey, how's your family doing?" And
oh, nice.
and she says, yeah, we're all fine, but it's just so crazy here. A lot of businesses are boarded up. There was a lot of rioting and looting. The streets don't really feel safe right now. It's like, oh yeah, we have one of those too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in Mexico too. Same thing.
Sure.
Over the feminist protests and riots.
Yeah. I mean, in America, a lot of the stuff that happened in America was pent up, had been going on for years, right? Particularly, grievances within the African American community, and then exacerbated by police action, right? So George Floyd gets strangled. A couple years before that, Michael, can't remember his last name. Hands up, don't shoot, right? So that was a big thing. I have a friend who was a SWAT officer who had to take somebody down who was threatening a baby with a knife, right? And then how that kind of spiraled into, it became a part of the Seattle protests too, right? So here in Seattle. And I think it's just, it's what you're seeing in other places. America just kind of went through it in the forefront, probably a little bit faster than some of these other places have. But I certainly think that America, the protests in America, have kind of pushed the these things, like making these things more likely to happen in other places.
When America sneezes, the world catches a cold.
Right.
So one thing that I noticed that's a sort of similar theme here. You have genuine issues. You had genuine issues in the U.S. like say the killing of Michael Brown or the killing of George Floyd, because whatever you say about the guy's character, he didn't deserve to die in that instance for what they were trying to arrest him for.
Right.
It was unnecessary death. That's fairly safe to say.
Yeah.
So that's a real issue. But then your friend killing a man with a knife held to a baby is not a real issue.
Yeah.
I want the police to shoot people who are doing that.
Right.
That's a legitimate use of force.
Right.
So there's illegitimate use of force, gets conflated with legitimate use of force, gets combined with all this sort of culture of both real issues and exaggerated issues, right? Because there's both.
Yeah.
There's real racism in America, and there's things that may not be racism that then get jumped in, like get put into that bucket, because it is a real category, it is a real thing, but not everything that people want to put in that bucket is in that bucket.
Belongs to the bucket.
Right.
And then you have an incident like this, which just lets all that pent up energy, like it just kind of explodes. It just feels like, yes, this thing here expresses exactly what we've all been feeling for such a long time.
Yeah.
And now it's time that we stand up to this in whatever way possible. And you have people with genuine political grievances and genuine political cause protesting, and then you have people who are freeloaders who use the chaos to try and personally enrich themselves through rioting and looting, who just want to see the world burn.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's fair. I also see, like, this kind of clash of ideas, right? It's more than just. I think it's not as simple as the history, or as either side likes to frame the argument, right? But they really are kind of having like a clash of like, all right, this is Western democracy that finds its roots in the all the way back to France, right? Like the Magna Carta, and coming into clash with a secular identity.
Hey, Magna Carta is England. Do not.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The French
I'm
credit
sorry.
for our
Well,
history.
okay, but the English also stole some of that from the French, right? Some stuff in the Magna Carta, French common law, which became English common law, which became grafted into America, right? So there's
And then America stole from the Magna Carta.
right. Yeah. Well, I'm just saying there are all these ideas, and they're all. I'm ashamed that I forgot that. It's,
Well, the Magna Carta sounds French. It's not from English.
right. The idea though is that these ideologies are clashing, and I kind of see this clash in France as well. I mean, the difference is that there were Americans who were angry at other Americans, right? But George Floyd was not a Muslim,
Yeah.
right?
That's the difference here.
Right.
In America, it's socioeconomic. It's
Right.
There's a racial component to it,
Yeah.
and there's a certain extent that sort of left-wing socialist ideas get injected into it as well in a big way.
Yes.
And those are all at play in France. But the thing that's in play in France here, that is in play in France, which is not in play here, is the element that most of these young men who are having trouble with the state are Muslim.
Right.
And there's now a clash. This is all happening on the backdrop of two worldviews that are clashing much more explicitly there than that's happening here.
Yeah,
Right.
totally.
Yeah, I think the interesting component is the response, though, right? So Islam has definitely different ideas of how a state should operate, and of course we're dealing with the modern secular state that's at work in Europe, and the way that these two things kind of collide has been really, I think, the groundwork for it. It's strange that the way that a lot of it's like a blending of an Islamic motive to a Marxist tactic, right? That's what I'm seeing.
Huh.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're seeing like the way that the riots evolve, right? The strategies that they use in organizing the riots, just the verbiage, right, is the same, except it has a Muslim backdrop, and it's the actors primarily are Muslims, right?
So just to recap on the history between Islam and France for a second here.
Sure.
This all starts in 732 when the Umayyad Caliphate actually trying to invade France from Spain, and they're beaten back by Charles Martel, who was part of France as a nation doesn't exist, but he's a Frank from the Frankish tribes, and Francia becomes France. So it's a big part of their history. So the establishment of the French state really comes by keeping the Islamic armies out of Europe, right? So then, then when in the sort of colonial age, France then has a lot of colonies in North Africa, in these currently Muslim countries, in Morocco, in Algeria, and a lot of the Muslims there were part of these former French colonies who then were imported to France for cheap labor.
Yeah.
And now there's 6 million people from those countries who are from that part of the world who have not felt welcomed into French society, and are now trying to sort of rediscover their identity, their cultural heritage.
I do think that in the government of France being intolerant, straight up, like more straight up than like United States.
Yeah.
People are like, oh, systematic racism and like institutional, but like it's way more. I mean, you can debate about that here. you can't debate about it as much in France. And like, I think that they're going to create a bigger problem for themselves. Like, maybe if Muslims could just be Muslim, they wouldn't become aggressive in the future. More aggressive. Like, the thing that they're creating the monster that they want to potentially. I'm not saying it's happened, but I could see it happening.
It's not just a secularist mindset. It's also a
national.
It's a nationalistic, kind of argument that's happening in France, right? So in America, we're not going, well, that's not American.
A little bit. There's voices out there.
There are, but the point is, people in America are saying this shouldn't be America, right?
Yeah.
But here, in France, they're going, this is definitely not French, right? Like, this is this idea,
Gotcha.
that there's more of a push to say we have to be less diverse to preserve French society and French culture, and that it's more like, you know what it reminded me of? It reminded me of the way that Japan dealt with missionaries back in when they were when the monks were trying to spread Christianity to Japan. The argument in Japan was this plant cannot grow in Japan. It is completely alien to Japanese society, right? And the way that they did it was they went into like more of a persecution mode, right? Like, they didn't go into persecution mode. They absolutely persecuted them.
Right.
Right.
In funny, the funny, interesting story about that though. This is a tangent, and we don't have much time for tangents. But when somebody went to Tokugawa, there was a Protestant missionary in Japan, and the Catholic priests, Catholic missionaries, went to the shogun and asked them to ban Protestant missionaries from Japan.
Right.
And the shogun says, I have absolutely no problem with this man. Don't ever bring this issue to my desk ever again.
Right.
He didn't say desk, but basically
right.
The shogun was like, yeah, I don't mind him, I don't like you.
That's interesting.
Right.
Dude, I have so many stories that were people doing that, Catholics.
So the argument I would make is that French secularism is more intellectually honest than American or British secularism.
It is.
I think yes, it's definitely less idealistic.
Yeah.
Right. Like, it's more concrete than abstract.
Yeah, it's got a more realistic idea of what it's trying to be.
Right.
Right. It knows. Secularism means that the rationalistic, materialistic worldview has to has to be triumphant here.
Yeah.
Religious people, you can live the life, you can live within our society, but you have to basically live as if what you believe is a fantasy.
Yes.
That we're agreeing to let you live by.
Well, I mean, I think it's an interesting contrast again, I don't want to backtrack too much, but it's the idea that in the United States, a lot of the argument goes, what is free speech, right? Like, I have the right to free speech, and that's not guaranteed in other places, right? I don't know if it is or isn't in France, but I know that their hate speech laws, for instance, are way more punitive than you would look at in comparison to us, or even Canada, right? Like, there are things you just can't say. Don't have that level of speech. Whereas in America, it's like, what can we say on Twitter? What can't we say on Twitter?
Yeah.
Right. So it's not necessarily like people are going to show up to your front door and lock you up for saying things. And in France, they don't have things like freedom of assembly and all this other stuff. So looking at it through a United States lens and looking at these two cultures kind of clashing, I don't think either one of those cultures actually believes either one of those things. Right?
Correct.
Right.
They just own what they believe.
Yeah.
Both of them are owning what they believe.
Exactly.
Whereas we don't own what we believe.
Correct.
You sent us 2 articles, and the 2 articles that we looked at, I mean, are actually fascinating because there's 2 very different points of view, right? Like, one was an absolute leftist point of view on what's going on. And it's like, I've read 1,000 of these articles. It's very sympathetic to, the struggle, and no mention of Islam, right? Like right at the top, just okay, he was Muslim, and then everything is about how the freedom fighters and the struggle against oppression and so it's like a co-opting,
Yeah.
right? And then on the other side, there's this French. There's an article that's what was it? It was like the French conservative position,
Yeah.
right? And they're talking about how they go right to Islam, right?
Yeah.
They go right to Islam. They
Yeah.
go right. This is a co-opting of French values. They point fingers politically. So there's. I feel like if the rest of the world is getting as polarized as we are, then that's what's being thrown around, And the Muslim perspective, which was really interesting, you sent us maybe you want to talk about that for a second.
We're in the section now of Islam versus secularism in France, kind of. We're going into there.
Yeah.
So feel free to
Yeah. So
close up or follow up.
Yeah. So the Muslim perspective on that is really a perspective. The guy we listened to, at least, it highlights the issue perfectly. That it's one worldview that believes it represents reality, and a different worldview that believes it represents reality, and they are clashing.
Right.
Because Islam, as a worldview, does want to control the state. That's not to say every individual Muslim is on some political crusade
agenda
to try and take over things, but Islam is a worldview that wants control of power. That's inherent to what it is. And secularism is the same thing. So both are kind of competing for this power in order to bring about the world they want to see. So it is inevitable that there's a clash going on there.
Yeah.
And but an Islamic country would be a mirror of what's happening in France right now. If Islamic expressions are suppressed in France, well, secular non-religious expressions would be curtailed in the Muslim world, and like actively are. So they're just a mirror of each other with a different worldview in its place.
Except that they're all trying to maybe communicate to the world that they are maybe the Muslim worldview is going to do some democracy, and maybe the secular worldview is like and we're democratic, which is kind of creates also another layer of problem.
But again, I don't think the French view is sustainable, but I do think it's more intellectually honest than the sort of typical American zeitgeist of secularism right now.
Yeah.
Well, why is America not like France? Why are we not intellectually honest?
Because the French Revolution is an innately secular expression. So that all their traditions come from secular thought.
There's no God involved in it.
There's no God involved in
La Revolution, are you sure?
Yeah. And America's, definitely got a more Christian heritage.
Exactly. So America comes from, while there's plenty of deists involved, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, is basically inherited from the Reformation through Geneva, through Scotland, through England, and then through America.
And then the entire legal code is kind of parts of it are adaptations of like Deuteronomy.
So how does that lead to the intellectual dishonesty then?
So the intellectual dishonesty is that America is founded essentially as a basically Christian country, not with a state church.
No.
But we have this idea of one nation under God. We have, the Declaration of Independence ends with, we give these things, our cause, over to the judge of all humanity.
So the reason that we're intellectually dishonest is because we have a history that we basically cannot quite ignore with like whatever new worldview, the secular worldview. Basically the history and the secular worldview for America cannot basically reconcile, whereas in France, the secular worldview and the history can reconcile.
Exactly.
You're saying they just abandoned God a long time ago?
Exactly, actually.
Yeah.
They abandoned God a long time
At
ago.
least from a sort of like legal standpoint.
From a legal standpoint, they rejected
I
Yeah.
mean, for instance,
God a long time ago.
black men were accepted in France much earlier than other places where black men were in places where other, like in the United States, for instance, during its formation, it
Oh,
was,
yeah.
black men were French citizens, right? As long as they were French, as long as they aligned themselves with France, as long as they had French parents, as long as, you know what I mean? Like there's a more of a collective secular outreach to it, and that's how you get Marxism. Honestly, that's like this idea where we're all the same as long, but in France it's nationalistic,
Yeah.
right? It's runs along nationalist lines.
And so just a sort of purely sort of secular in its humanism, and it starts with this idea of what we're going to do is we're going to burn the whole thing down, execute the ruling class with guillotines,
Right.
and we're going to start from scratch using the best thinking modern man has to offer.
Right.
Whereas the American Revolution was more of a reformation than it was a revolution. They weren't trying to burn everything down and start fresh. They were basically saying, we have this heritage. These are the things that went wrong. These are the way we can make these things right.
Okay.
And so there's a lot of the people there's a lot of the people in England, for example,
Okay.
who didn't support the French Revolution, did support the American Revolution.
Interesting.
And so the American Revolution had a lot of people in England who were saying, just let them go. They're doing a right and reasonable
Interesting.
thing. We shouldn't get in the way of this.
Okay. I feel like I'd rather, yeah. I mean, I feel like I'd rather live somewhere where, like, there is whatever the prevailing worldview, whether it be secularism or religion, where it can be tolerant still. Whereas it seems like that's not an option in France.
And here is why. So in France, the secular worldview relies on power innately,
Yeah.
because the concern is that if the ideas don't seem to be working, then you have to keep those ideas in power no matter what. Because if secularism comes from people, then it's people's job to preserve that for the greater good no matter what. Whereas in a Christian worldview, we believe that God commands us to be tolerant of people. Jesus didn't use coercion to change people's minds. He relied on persuasion.
Do you think that France would be better off if it were more, if it looked more like the United States? Because now it seems like their only option is going to be secularism or Islam. I don't think, Christians don't inherently seek for political power. I mean, people will argue about that in the United States, whatever, Congress, but that's different. Like,
It's
France,
it's happening in France. It's
Christians,
happening as a pushback to secularism in France. This is actually.
But I'm saying, like, Christians won't inherently go looking because they're not establishing a caliphate or what you're saying, power through secularism.
So here's what would make France a better place to live. So rather than talking about, of course it'd be better if it was Christian, I want to talk about the substance.
But even if it looked like America, which America is, like, hypocritical.
Yeah. So what would make France better, what would make this situation better, would be a large population of people who disagreed with the mindset of the Muslims living there, yet still loved them as individuals.
What about what about the seculars?
And you need Christians to treat the secular people that way as well.
Yeah.
You need a
But that's not going to be a governmental response.
No, it's not. But the government is
because they want law. Muslims want to wear hijabs. They want these things, and they're not going to get that through the government ever.
Correct.
Ever.
But however, that is that the government changes through the cultural change, right? The reason
Yeah.
the government is acting this way is because secular French people are freaked out by the Muslim population.
Secular French are freaked out. Yeah, and vice versa.
So they keep voting for people who promise these solutions.
Sure.
And so the culture has to change before the politics change. And there's so few Bible-believing Christians in France right now, but what Christians need to be in this type of situation are people who are going to represent God's love and God's truth. So here in Seattle, we have a bunch of Afghan refugees. And sometimes we deal with situations where you have men who want to keep their wives home, will not let them leave the house, and you're threatening them that they go out or they take their hijab off. And what the conversation I've had with a few people is, listen, if your wife wants to wear a hijab all the time and stay in the house all the time, she is more than welcome to do that here. If you force your wife to stay home and to dress like that all the time, you're committing a crime, and that is not tolerated here. And I'm going to make sure that's not tolerated here.
Yeah,
So-
which is a community approach as opposed to a governmental or policing approach.
Well, I mean, we all live under the banner of the law in the United States, right?
Mm-hmm.
And whether anyone wants to acknowledge it or not in another country, you still live under the banner of law. So the core of the argument is this just, right, in France? This was unjust.
Unjust.
Right. So how different parties are leveraging this is unjust is a completely different story. For me, as Christians, it's in book of Matthew, I think it's 5:9 or 5:8 or something, says, blessed are the peacemakers, right? So we're in a unique position where I think that we can do that, but we have to do it from a place where we're talking about the love of Jesus, because that's what differentiates us, right? That's what differentiates us from Muslims. That's what differentiates us from a modern secular state or even the American state, right? Like, we are Christians and we are called to reconcile humanity to God. We're supposed to bring them the gospel. If we're doing what we're called to do, right, which is go into all nations and make disciples of all nations and baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, right? Like, if we're doing that and we're leading people to Christ in the middle of turbulent times, I mean, we're presented with an opportunity, I think, to not just deal with a political problem or the clash of two different societies, because ultimately as Christians, I believe we have the answer, right? I believe we have the answer. It's not disrespectful to anyone else's religion or anything like that, or anyone's state or anything, any country, any banner that they fall under.
Which in James's example of like, I would tell someone that they can wear a hijab or not wear a hijab. Now, would that be because you're like submitting to law as Christians
The
should
law
submit
in
to law?
America, right,
Or because
is that you can wear a hijab if you want to,
right.
right? If the law in France is you cannot wear a hijab, right? It's unfortunate for a Muslim who feels like they're compelled to wear a hijab.
And compelled to live in France.
So I could sit there and I could say, right, and compelled to live in France, right? And I could sit there and say, well, why I gotta leave it, buddy, get out. But the point is, here's what Jesus tells me about you as a human being, right? And sure, it doesn't line up with either one, but it is the truth, right? It's the truth of what God says about humanity. It's the truth of what God says about who He is. And it's also a truth about how we are called to live in light of that, right? Paul talks about submission to the law.
That's what I was
right?
more so...
Like, follow the law,
Yeah, for sure. But there's also a scenario where, especially in a place like America, and at one point in France, where Christians may have a voice in what laws get made and don't make.
Absolutely.
Right. So in that moment, I think we've got to think through things biblically, and we've got to realize that we need to operate on persuasion rather than coercion. So for example, right? If I was the king of America and make American laws, I would allow a Muslim woman to wear a hijab, which is already allowed, and I would also not legalize polygamy, right? Which is also not legal.
Right.
I wouldn't do anything different.
Right.
But there's you've got to kind of like pick your line.
Which
if
I
was
think,
if I was king of America, I would straight to like, I have all the money.
that's crazy. Which I think like the Muslim perspective that we got to listen to through Muslim Thinks podcast is kind of what they want. They were like, what he was saying was, you can't erase our Muslimness. And at this point, they're trying to be erased so hard that I think that they would take that. I think, maybe not everyone, I think they'd be like, yeah, okay, like hijabs, that's a good step. Okay, no polygamy? All right, like, although I don't see why French would be against polygamy.
Mm-hmm.
The French secularists should accept polygamy.
Except that the Muslims do it, so.
Except for that, yeah. So, right, so it's like, anyway.
I've been married for 17
But, yeah,
years.
then
I've been married for coming up on 17 years. I don't know why anyone would want another wife. I love my wife. I just don't know how any, like, well-adjusted, rational man could handle, like, taking care of 2 wives.
It's a lot.
It's a lot.
But, like, anyway, the murder of Nahel was wrong. I wonder what the prosecution is gonna come down to. I mean, there's a lot of people that are like, it was Nahel's fault, that are saying that.
I mean, they did that in the United States too. You know, the Michael Brown story is not as clean as it was presented to us when it initially came out. The point about investigations is that they take time, and the truth will eventually come out. You hope, right?
Yeah.
And like,
and the French like to lie about it, like right at the outset, you know.
And like, punish a crime for what that crime is. Yes, he was underage driving, and then there's a bunch of other things about, oh, he was doing this and that and that. Okay, don't kill him.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I've seen the roads in France. Everyone should be punished for their traffic violations.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
No one in that country should be allowed to drive a car.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Everyone has the right of way if you're going,
like,
unless you're from the Middle East or from New Jersey. Otherwise, it's every man for himself.
Like, I want to maybe touch on, I mean, when we look at the video, like, maybe none of us are police here. Maybe it'd be beneficial to you have a police friend, SWAT friend. Like, it's a lot of pressure for sure. I feel like police also just like accidentally kill people all the time. No. And like, that's just part of it. You don't think so?
I highly disagree with that.
Really?
We're running out of time here.
Different spot, but I highly disagree.
You highly disagree?
I mean, it's billions of dollars in training, you know, and if that was the case, then every cop would do it.
Okay.
We don't have enough rabbits for this hole right now.
Yeah.
But I think to summarize, right, there's this specific issue, and then there's the general cultural issue that France has to figure out how to deal with both poor minorities and the Muslim community. Otherwise, it's only going to keep getting worse.
Yeah.
And what needs to change is ultimately hearts and minds more than laws, because the laws simply reflect what's going on in the hearts and minds of people in the country right now.
Yep.
All right. Well, guys, thanks for listening. We will be back next time.